Well, welcome everybody to our Winter Member Quarterly, Successfully Pairing Your Data Sources. I'm Christine DeGregory, AAQEP's Director of Professional Learning, and we'll be introducing our fabulous presenters, and Mark, who will be kind of our question taker and moderator at points today. So here we go. We're going to have our introductions in just a moment, then we'll be framing the topic, and then we will hear from colleagues at Central Michigan University and Concordia University, St. Paul, and then of course have time for your questions. You are welcome to place questions in the chat during the presentation because maybe the way you will hold on to them, but please stay muted until the very end, and then we can engage in some conversation at the end. So very quickly, I'll just say hello to Mark Peterson, AAQEP's President and CEO. We have Ray Francis joining us from Central Michigan University. And where's Lynn Gehrke? Wave from you, Lynn. Thank you. And Athena Novak, also from Concordia University. So these are our marvelous presenters today. Thank you so much in advance for your time and sharing your experiences with us. And with that, I will pass the baton to you, Mark.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Great to see everyone. I just have to say this is something of an all-star cast that we have here today presenting. Ray, so glad to have you. Ray has been a part of AAQEP from the very beginning and was one of the team leads on one of the very first site visits that we've done. So he's been watching our development all along and worked in accreditation for years, knows a lot about the challenges of putting together. Lynn and Athena from Concordia University in St. Paul put together one of the most interesting sets of data displays and did some great work on putting it together. Because as you all know, one of the challenges we have in accomplishing the kind of program evaluation focused around standards that constitutes accreditation is taking the very many pieces of evidence that we have that come in different forms and formats and finding a way to tell a coherent story together. And so I'm just delighted. I've just been waiting for this session to happen. And so one little note for you all, just so you can think about timing. We typically give presenters 20 minutes each, so we've spent a couple minutes getting started, 20 minutes for each presentation, and then about 15 minutes at the end. Both of our sets of presenters have a tremendous amount to present to you, so we've said each presentation will have 25 minutes. That'll leave us only a little time towards the top of the hour, but everyone has agreed, all three of our presenters have agreed to stay past the top of the hour, so you'll get a few bonus minutes to ask some questions if you too have time to stay. And if not, the whole thing will be recorded and we'll make sure that you get that. So without any further ado, let me give you Mr. Ice Storm is flashing outside. We hope your internet lasts. Dr. Ray Francis at Central Michigan.
And thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yes, I'm in the middle of, I live in Michigan, the upper part. We're in the midst of a snowstorm that went to rain that now has severe winds, and that means ice up here. So if I fade out at some point in time, you have my sincere apologies, because anytime somebody gives me the opportunity to talk about looking at data from a different perspective, I will take it. Again, my name is Ray Francis, Central Michigan University. One of the things that my colleague Mark Gehrke and I have been working on for a while is how we look at data. Neither one of us, and probably in particular me, we're not very happy with the way we looked at data, or we look at data as being very prescriptive. And one of the things that we have enjoyed about AAQEP is that opportunity to take and look at data to tell a story, to inform. And you can, Christine, the piece of this that we came to realize a while back is that institutions over-collect data. We have more data than we ever need about things. Problem is, oftentimes we don't have the right data, and the data we have doesn't fit well. It can be many, many, many different kinds of things, and we need to remember that the purpose is to improve. We don't always remember that. Chrissy? You see, the second part of that is there are a lot of different tough questions to be asked and answers. And those answers require cohesive, collaborative approaches. We can't have data sets that are unique and separate that don't inform one another. It doesn't do us well from the title of my part of the presentation. It doesn't do us well to have a basket of apples and a basket of oranges if they can't work and give us some information. This led Mark and I to working on about an idea of what we refer to as messy data. And the messy data part is that when you look at it, it is messy. Oh yes, we very, very much would like it to be cut and dry. We would like to have everything on it 70, 80, 90% scale. We'd like to know this. We'd like to not have to round off in decimals. We'd like to have all those different kind of things. Life just doesn't work that way, no matter how we want it to be. And the thing we need to remember about all of this process is that when we look at it, this is about your students. It's not about my students, it's about your students. And what you do in assessment, evaluation, accreditation is about your students. It's about your program. It's about you. And it's about how you work at and enable yourself to begin telling that story that you have. And as we look at it, within this idea of data, there are some opportunities that we need to look at. What are those tough questions? What are those difficult decisions that we sometimes have to look at? And some of this information comes from my colleagues in Michigan at our accreditation conference that we have. We have one coming up where we have taken the opportunity to look and to build and to construct a bigger understanding of what is data and how can we use it. You see, some of the tough questions include, are you gathering data for compliance or improvement? They are significantly different in their scope. They're significantly different in their process, and they are significantly different in the ways we can use that data. Are you gathering data to demonstrate meeting standards, which is different than how are we improving our program? Are we meeting standards? Or are we improving? Different ways to look at data. Are we looking at, among other things, leading? Or are we looking at adhering to a structure? And within our data, that often becomes true. We take a look and say, well, we've been gathering this data for 5 years, it's good enough. We've been doing this, it's good enough. Those kinds of things. Are we gathering information and data for sense making? Which becomes important because if we're to tell our story, we need to make sure that we are in fact gathering data that can make sense. Are we generating that idea of voice, agency, and action? And whose story is being told? At the risk of annoying any administrators in the room, oftentimes we are telling the story of administration rather than telling the story of student learning and student performance. And it comes back down to how much is too much data to gather and how much is not enough. And all those things going together produce a really unique situation that we call messy data. Now, in this picture, you'll see, I like to joke that this is a friend of mine's desk. In truth, I found it online. And in truth, even I, as messy as I am, couldn't survive with that. But think about what are the messy data that exists around your decisions. How many kinds of data do you gather and collect? Because whenever we're talking to faculty versus program directors versus administrators, we often find out that they all have a different version of data. Sometimes it's not always about cleaning up the mess, but it's understanding the mess as it is. So when we're looking at it, why is your data messy? One of the top reasons is because we try and look at qualitative and quantitative data at the same time. Now, we're going to talk in a little bit about how to address this, but very oftentimes you'll have individuals say, well, you can't use qualitative data to tell your story because it's not this or it's not that or it's no. Qualitative data through authentic assessment can be a very important and integral part to what it is you're looking at. Demographic trends and demographic labels, depending on how we label data, it becomes very messy. I have a friend at a different institution who just their simple vocabulary keeps them from using lots and lots of different data sets. Standardized versus localized kinds of data can be messy because standardized data for assessments is pretty much set and can't be revised, so to speak, for the collection versus localized. Well, how then do we make those data sets fit together? One of my favorites is when we look at rigorous data or what we consider rigorous data versus low-hanging fruit. We're all guilty of it at some point in time, of picking what's easy, what's available, and what it is we can show our students are doing wonderful work. Oh, look, let's use this particular measure because it shows our students are performing at a 99%, 100% of the time. Well, that doesn't tell us anything. That only tells the story that, you know, which one perhaps of the data to pick to show a good story, but it doesn't show how your students are performing and getting better. Remember that as we're going through, your data is not binary. It's not a yes or a no. It's not an on or an off. It's not those kind of things, but it's complementary. And when we start looking at data as being in that complementary mode, it becomes a way for us to get and to be much more effective at the kind of things you're doing. So, what processes do you have? And you don't have to answer. I know we'll get to questions in due time, but what processes do you have to deal with your tough decisions and messy data? Well, it's important. The one that I'm going to focus on most today is how about making qualitative data into quantitative data. Now, some of you know how to do this really, really well. Some of you are sort of in the camp that says you can't do that. Well, you can, but you have to have an open mind into telling your story and saying, what does the data mean? And where this comes from is a process that Mark and I developed called visual scaling. Now, I'm going to ask you to humor me for just a second. If you can, I would like for you to pretend that you are and have been a long-term tennis player who has swung the racket too many times, and you've begun to suffer from that ailment that we sometimes call, as some of us get older, tennis elbow. You might then go to your general practitioner. They'll send you to a clinic, and eventually you end up at a physical therapist. And they're going to tell you what's wrong. And you say the old joke, it hurts when I do this. And then they'll say, well, then don't do that. However, you say, I want to get back to playing tennis. So they ask you to hold out your arm. Wonderful. And then they say, now bend it until it starts to hurt. Well, some of us bend it this much, some of us bend it this much, some of us bend it more. There's all kind of different data points in there. Data is what the medical profession gathers observationally, and then they rate you. They may not tell you that, but they rate you. They're often say you're a 3 or a 5, you're a 9, you're this or that. You'll oftentimes see in the physical therapist's office, they have a little kind of a protractor, a scale that says, oh, you can move this many degrees of this. Outstanding. And then eventually you'll do some exercises and you'll come back and do the same thing. And they'll say, oh, look at that. You've made great progress. Here's your new baseline. And that's what we're talking about with visual scaling, not being afraid to reset our baseline data. There's an article there that I've also included as a document that you can get to that overviews this entire process. But this physical therapy piece that I'm explaining to you is one way of establishing qualitative data and translating it into a quantitative perspective. So it happens, and it happens all the time. Observational data gets turned into rubric scores and scales and numbers and all kinds of different things. Then what do? 2 slides forward, Christine. Then as we look at the visual scaling process, see, here's where we have to overcome our fear. And it's a fear of a 0. We want those students to be at the 99th percentile, 99% of the time. We want to show them doing things. And our mindset needs to change a little bit. Because you see, if we're here doing our exercise and we take this as a 0, this is a good progress. If we take then later, this is a 0, this becomes a good progress. Progress can become situational and it can become changeable over time. What it has to do with is where you set your 0. And a 0 in what we talk about is a good thing. I know. And if I had the copyrights, I would, at this point in time, insert the Schoolhouse video of 0 My Hero, which, just saying, if you know it, it's a great song, but it's true. And as we look at this, then we also are going to be talking about not establishing too many criteria or too many different levels. We advocate from looking and working with a variety of different things up to a total of 7, a -3, a -2, a -1, a 0, a 1, 2, and a 3. If you do too many more than that, your data doesn't show information for what you want the program to show. Okay? And then, of course, you're going to collect, process, score, and analyze your data. But that idea of a 0 becomes important. For example, in our next slide, you're going to see here's a sample scale. Oh my, for those folks who are compulsive, concrete, linear, you're not going to like this one. But one of the things you got to remember is that from my perspective, looking at creating the scale comes about as a result of our professional understanding of how things work and how things fit. So that if almost all of our students score between 98 and 100 on a particular assessment, well, maybe we set that as the top level. Then the next level has, maybe it's 3 spaces. I know it's not even, it's not intended to be. This scale actually developed from a group of faculty who sat down looking at an assessment and said, before we looked at the data, what do we expect from our students and their performances? It's not equal across the ranges. It's not linear, we know that. But it's based on professional knowledge. It's based on you, giving you the opportunity to tell your story. And here's an example of it. I'll try and move through this one. Let's say we take for visual scaling for our purposes and say we're doing 4 administrations of a heterogeneous group of data over time, group A, B, C, D, and overall. Wow. We look at it, it's like 68, 74, 83, 88 height. They have an increased performance at each table. You can demonstrate that. You can put that in a chart. You can say, look at us. We are really good. We show performance, we show increase, we show this, we show that. We're doing wonderful. And if we change to the next slide, you'll see same thing represented as a bar graph. Administration 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you see that group A and group D kind of follow the right pattern. You see that group B and group C don't. But our overall data shows that everybody's improving. So we take a look at that overall data as an institution or as a programmer and whatever we're doing, and we say, oh, here, look, we're doing great. And we sometimes ignore what our story is telling us. And that becomes important. We sometimes get so caught up in telling a positive story that we forget to look at and tell the story of our students. I'll say that again. We sometimes get so caught up in telling our story that we fail to look at our students and how are they doing. So in our next slide, I'm going to show you what it would be is if we were using a different scale. If we had set up that very first scale that I showed you for the 0, and you look and it's like, oh my gosh, Ray, there's like 100 zeros going all across that table. And I would say, that's pretty good. But what does it show us? It shows us that group A progressed a little bit, but they really didn't progress out of what we thought they should. Same for group B. Oh, group C, there's a minus number in there. I know we hate minus numbers almost as much as we hate zeros. But this says that at some point in time, group C had a step back and then recovered well. And then group D, well, they were performing and then they were the yeomen working on getting everything done. And they're the ones who pulled everybody forward. So that in our graph that I showed you, it looks like we are all doing just fine. When in fact, when we try and tell that story in the next slide, we've got several different movements forward. But if we don't stop and look, we miss the fact that group C had something going on. Did they recover at the end? Yes, they recovered wonderfully. Did they do well? Yes, they did. But if we don't take a look at our data from this zero-based perspective, we oftentimes end up not being able to make good and effective decisions. We can after a bit, or you can send Mark for the next slide, which becomes, there are examples of this at course-specific levels, at program-specific levels. I do a lot of work with reappointment, promotion, and tenure, and authentic assessment, where we take data that's gathered in the classroom, translated from authentic assessments into quantifiable results for faculty seeking promotion and tenure. The last 2 slides there, the next one is some resources, which is a page of resources that are available from Mark, DeShane, and I. It's a variety of presentations and all kinds of different stuff. And then in closing, what I would say about this is, when you look at a scale, don't be afraid to change it. Don't be afraid to say, our students are naturally performing here. What about the students who are performing at a different level? What can we find out about them? Grades aren't the response, sometimes all kinds of things. Maybe it is an authentic assessment that you want to give your students and then translate that data into something quantifiable for these doggone accreditation agencies so that you can tell your story and share it with other people. You see, you know what your story is. You need to find the right way to tell it. And in finding the right way to tell it, you've got the opportunity to use so many different tools and so many different things that are at your disposal. Don't be afraid to step outside of the box, because even if you're using authentic assessments that are qualitative in nature, we can demonstrate them as a quantifiable resource that satisfies all kinds of different things. And if we do it through the visual scaling process, you can see all your students' growth and all the different things that they fall back into. So it becomes that opportunity to tell your story.
All right. Thank you, Ray.
Yes, Karen, I'll be glad to.
Thank you, thank you. And we're also going to send out these slides to everyone. So thanks for that. Thank you, Ray. I'm reminded listening to you of a speaker I heard this summer in Michigan at a Michigan Assessment Consortium conference, Andrew Ho from Harvard, who's an assessment researcher. He said, we often imbue data, we imbue numbers with more permanence and with more precision than what they have. And I think you're really highlighting the malleability of the scales that we can use to pull things together. So folks, we're going to keep on track and turn it over to our colleagues from Concordia. Please do drop any questions that you have along the way, though, into the chat, because we'll gather all them up and we'll have some time. So apologies for not getting to dive in right now in the moment with questions for Ray's presentation. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Lynn and to Athena. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ray. It was nice to hear you talk about your presentation again. I went to your and Mark's presentation in Atlanta in early 2020, kind of right before the world stopped, right? And I got there a little late and sat in the back and was just found everything we had been looking for. You talk about apples and oranges. We had apples and oranges and bananas and pumpkins and everything that didn't match. And we had been struggling probably since 2015 in trying to figure out how to represent our data as it compares to both our state standards. So we get approval from the state of Minnesota every 7 years to continue to be a teacher prep program. So we have a whole set of content standards from the state. And then we have our AAQEP standards, and how do they come together, and can we map those together? But anyway, we tried many different things, from just printing out all our data sets and giving it to faculty and saying, here, make sense of it, which of course was a complete failure, to that day in Atlanta going, wow, this could work for us. You know, all the fine points you just talked about, we probably didn't get there, but what I heard in that session was enough to get us to a point of being able to make sense of our data. And so we were at that point in 2020 preparing for not only a state visit, but an AAQEP visit, and what does our data tell us? And we had been kind of forgetting about our data for a couple of years, like programs are prone to do. So after your session, my colleague and I sat down, Athena, she's going to talk soon, and we said, okay, what are the data sets that we believe we can use to represent our student progress around these standards. So it took us a while, because up until this point, we had been just saying, oh, final Ed TPA score, for example. But there's 15 scores within Ed TPA. There's 15 rubric scores. So which ones can we align to aspects of standard 1, for example, in AAQEP? Which ones can we align to the standards of effective practice in the state of Minnesota? So we decided to use mostly our standardized data sets. So you can see we use Ed TPA task scores. We use Ed TPA rubric scores. We have Minnesota teacher licensure exams. So we have content exam pass rates. We have Minnesota teacher licensure exams for pedagogy. We use subtest 2 for certain aspects of standard 1 and certain standards from the state. And then we have one locally constructed data set that we use, and it's our final student teaching evaluation items. We spent a lot of time with these data sets trying to figure out, so which rubrics actually get at, aspect 1B, for example. So we extensively reviewed the language. What does the language of these data sets tell us? We did a deep dive into the objectives for the Minnesota teacher licensure exams. What does a score on this particular objective help us see? And then we paired those data sections, right? Those pieces with the rubrics or with the aspects. You can move on. So for example, we took the language of AAQEP 1D, and you can see what we underline. What did we highlight? So what of our data sets helps us understand our teacher candidates' use of data for student learning, assessment and data literacy, and then their use of data to inform practice? So as you can see, we chose Ed TPA task 3 scores. We chose pedagogy subtest 2 pass rates because of specific content assessed. And we chose 4 specific items from the final student teaching evaluation. So we did that for every aspect, for every data set, before we even began to try to make sense of it. Next slide.
So then the next step we had to do was to try to make sense of all the data that we were able to match from our standardized tests to the different aspects. And so we took a look at what the state had for us for cut scores, what the state provided for average scores, but we really had to come together as a department to figure out what did we want to meet our expectations. And so we decided to put everything on a 3-point scale. And we first defined what was meeting our expectations. And then we were able to obviously say what was below our expectations, but we also wanted to show when we were able to exceed our expectations. The easiest one to do was Ed TPA, because Minnesota had specific passing scores for our students. And so students pass the Ed TPA by task if they have a 13, 13, or 12. And so we decided to use that threshold of 13. You can see that in the bottom data set there. We decided to use that 13 to meet our standards. And if they scored a 13, they're meeting our department expectations. So anything below that was below our expectations. And we also wanted to identify when our students are exceeding our expectations. And so with the Ed TPA being on a 5-point scale for each rubric, we figured that getting 4 out of 5 would have been an exceeding standard. And so we decided that a score of 20 out of 25 would then be exceeding our expectations. And as Lynn has mentioned before, some of our scores were actually down to the specific rubrics for EdTPA. So if we went back a slide for just a second, so you can see the top there is when we actually picked out specific rubrics from the EdTPA to go along with any of the aspects. So then instead of being out of 25 points, obviously these were out of 5 points. And so then we got our meeting score at 2.6 because that would be 13 divided by 5. And everything else kind of took place after that. Now we can move forward. The next two were a little bit more difficult, the content and the pedagogy exams, just because the data was reported to us as pass rates, and there wasn't necessarily a score that we could go off of from the state. But rather we had to determine as a department, what does a quality program, what score, how many students should be passing in a quality program? And as a department, we decided to go with 80%. We need at least 80% of our students to be passing to be able to say that we are offering a quality program. And so that's how we ended up with our meets department expectations. And of course, then exceeding, we decided to go with that 90% range. On the next slide, you can see that the information mirrors the last slide. So content and pedagogy are the same. We decided again, 80% was meeting our department expectations. The very last tool that we used then was the final student teaching evaluation. And this assessment that we use in our department is based off of 4 points. And so a 4 is an advanced score, a student teacher that is showing advanced qualities. A 1 is a beginner. A score of 2 and 3 was developing and proficient. And we decided as a team that we want our students to have more 3s than 2s, if you would. And so that would average out to being more than 2.5. And so that's how we ended up with our 2.6 for meeting our department expectations. And then, of course, we were able to come up with the below expectations and our exceeding expectations. We were then able to take all of these scales, if you would, and provide scores to every single piece of data that we had on a 1, 2, or 3. You can go to the next slide. And not only did we decide to go with that 1, 2, or 3 for below expectations, meeting expectations, or exceeding expectations, but we'd also decided to color code all of our data charts. Because by color coding our data charts, it was very easy to visualize where our area strengths are and where our areas of growth existed. And you can go to the next slide for Lynn.
We chose a standard 1E where we had a little less pink. If we had chosen the aspect for assessment, I'm blanking on which one that is, C or D maybe, there was a lot more pink. But on this chart, you can see for every aspect on AAQEP, and we used the same chart when the state came to do a site visit, we just adjusted the items we were measuring. You see programs, the programs we offer on the far left column. And we did every data set, every aspect by program. Because some programs are exceeding where other programs are really struggling. And we wanted to get to that point where we're saying, you know, elementary ed is doing well on standard 1E. Just visually, you can see dark green exceeds our expectations, light green meets our expectations. But for example, Phi Ed on this one is struggling in the area of EdTPA rubric 6. What are we going to do about that in that particular program? Up until this point, we tended to lump all of secondary together. Up until going to Mark's session, you know, taking a deep dive, realizing that each program is different, and where are our work areas? But for every aspect, then we provided this kind of chart in our QAR, and then wrote a descriptive, a narrative about what do we see, what do we think is going on, and where are some of the areas where we've tried to make some improvements. But I will say that asking ourselves, what do we expect of our students? As Athena said, where do we place the meets expectations? We teach our students this in methods courses when we're talking about their own student data, and we wanted to model the same. We also are using the data sets. I know Ray talked about, are we doing it for meeting standards? Are we doing it for improvement? For us in the state of Minnesota, if we aren't meeting certain content standards provided us by the state, that is an area for improvement. So we're taking these pink areas, and every year as a department, then we meet and we say, well, what data-driven decisions are we going to make for this particular program, and in what class could that take place, and what do we need to do about that? Honestly, data, Athena and I have so much fun now because our faculty is buying in, because this means something to them. A pile of pieces of paper with numbers on it didn't mean anything to them, and it didn't really mean anything to us. So I just can't thank you enough, Ray, for that day in Atlanta. And we're getting better. We're looking at changing some of our evaluative ranges, like you mentioned. It's okay to make changes. Our state cut scores for content and pedagogy were just changed. So as we go forward, Athena and I are going to need to meet and look at those ranges and figure that out. But it's fun again. And maybe not everybody thinks that's fun, but we do. And our faculty feels like they feel like they're more able to make decisions because of the way the data is presented to them. Thank you, Mark.
All right. Thank you so much. And I think I have to say one thing I've learned is that I'm a lousy judge of how long things are going to take. So thank you all, both presentations, for moving through this, presenting this information so succinctly. And I'll just say a couple of things that I see that are very important. And looking at the chat, but also at this point, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your questions that you have. Just a couple of things. We talk in AAQEP all the time about the importance of establishing your own criteria of success for measures, and about the value of disaggregation, and about the importance of display, and about the importance of bringing multiple measures together. And I think Athena and Lynn, on that last slide, even though I'm waiting to hear what Ray thinks about the fact that you did avoid the 0 and the negative numbers, which I assume is fine. Anyway, aside from that, just what a tremendous visual display. And I remember reading through your whole quality assurance report and seeing, graph after graph, or chart up, table after table after table, that was, as you say, not conveying detailed information in terms of numbers around particular things, but a tremendous visual representation that said, okay, I see. You put it there. So I think it's just wonderful to see it presented like this. Let me stop though and say, colleagues who are on the screen, what questions do you have for Ray or for Lynn and Athena? I think the ice storm knocked Ray out. So Lynn and Athena, it's all going to be.
I will say that the zeros and the minuses, that's probably the part I missed by getting to his presentation late that day in Atlanta. But it's certainly, I think Athena, being the numbers person, might be saying to me soon, maybe we need to look at that. So, but again, we're always looking to get better at this. But I cannot say enough how this kind of analysis made us better, and we'll just keep fine-tuning it.
Yeah. All right. Brian.
I have a question for Athena and Lynn. I'm intrigued by the summaries that you have, the summary column for each of your disciplines and how you average across your different measures. I'm curious whether you consider all of your measures to be equally important in contributing to that summary, or if there's some that are more important for you than others, if you could comment on that.
That's a good question. I'll leave the math part to Athena. I have been thinking about that a little bit because they aren't all the same, right? But the state requires them of our students for either completing a program or getting a license. So maybe there's people on here that aren't as managed or micromanaged by their state as Minnesota is. But we have to consider those standardized assessments very carefully because the state looks at us through those lenses. Athena, what about you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian, because that was actually one of the conversations that we did have, especially around the first example that Lynn had shared. If you remember back to that one, it was looking at something from EdTPA, looking at one of the pedagogy exams, but then it was looking at 4 different questions from the final student teacher eval. And so when we looked at that chart, do those 4 final student teaching evals, do they get weighed equally compared to the EdTPA and the pedagogy? And we did decide in this particular presentation of our data that on that slide that they would all carry the same weight. On the one that you see here, you'll see that there was only one student teaching eval, and so then it was each a third, a third, a third. But on the other example that we don't have a chart of, then the final student teaching eval actually weighed in, more like, I'm going to say 50% of the actual score when you think of that we were taking each one individually.
Thank you. I think it would be very tricky to come up with a weighting, but I think it might be worth considering, and as you move forward.
Yeah.
So that one item doesn't count against the whole test is equally weighted.
Right. Athena, you can put your thinking cap on for that one.
Yeah.
Right. It strikes me that in order to implement this kind of a plan, one of the things that you talked about is a particularly important move, and one that I think isn't always easy to do, and that is to have the discussion with faculty in a large scale, or with colleagues in a large scale, about what the criteria for success is. And as you told the story, it all made sense. My hunch is the conversations might have been a little bit messier getting there, maybe not, I don't know. But as you were talking about that, because another thing that resonates for me in this presentation is you said, look, this is our data. We have to decide what it means. And sure, the state gives us some cut scores. There is some guidance there. But in the end, especially with the locally developed measures, we have to think about how we put this together and say, what's good enough? How are we going to define that range that's acceptable? What are we going to define as above and below that range? And then, because that gives you the leverage for taking action and deciding what to do. But getting to that point, right? So often we get data and we amass it and we pull it together and we send it off, and we analyze it at a little different level. But that was a really interesting moment. What were those conversations like, and what were the challenging things about them?
I will say, based on history of bringing these kinds of discussions to our colleagues, we decided this time around to bring a draft. So we, Athena and I, sat down and aligned pieces of data sets to aspects of Standard 1 and Standard 2. We made that chart. We looked at state cut scores and state averages, and together the two of us created the meets, exceeds, falls below, and then brought it to the faculty. So we had something to work with, because prior experience showed us if we came with a blank slate, it was just impossible. People checked out. Some didn't even want a part of it. But if you bring something to work on, right? Most people are drawn in. And so that's what we did. And I don't even think that we tweaked much, because our reasoning was spot on. I don't think people had a lot to say, did they, Athena?
Yeah, I think it was so helpful because we did go into the why of, this is what we came up with and what we were thinking, but this is why we thought these things. Now, what do you think? And there were just a handful that we did tweak just a little bit. But yeah, for the most part, because we were able to explain our why, and then have that conversation, they were able to, approve or change as they thought.
And if your colleagues are like ours, not everybody wants to be a part of that conversation. Not everybody even wants to have a say, because it doesn't matter to them. But we found it mattered more because they had something to look at first. So I don't think it was as messy, maybe, Mark, as you might think, thankfully.
Well, that's good news. I hate to be, yeah. Wen, I see your hand. Yes, hi, Wen, good to see you. You're muted, Wen.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Lynn and Athena, for your interesting presentation. Sorry, I missed the first part of it because of another meeting. So I was just curious whether you are using the 6 aspects for each of the standard 1 and 2, and then organizing like 12 charts like the one you just shared with us.
Yes. Yes,
Wow.
because each aspect calls for different data sets. So we use multiple data sets for each aspect, but each aspect is asking for something different. So it might be rubrics 4 and 5 from a TPA for aspect A, and rubric 6 for aspect E. So we really looked hard at the language of the pieces of our data sets compared to the aspects of the standards.
Okay.
And then
So
what we were able,
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, then what we were able to do is, using the chart from each of our aspects, we took that very last column that gave us 1 score for that aspect, and we made an overall standard chart. And so aspect A, B, C, D, E, and then we were able to come up with a score at the end of each standard as well.
Okay. So Mark, for institutions, are we going to be able to be viewed, favorably if we meet the 6 aspects for each of standard 1 and 2? We don't have to do similar work for standard for the different aspects for standard 3 and 4.
Yeah, this method wouldn't work as well for standards 3 and 4. Yeah, this would not. Although it's interesting, and I'll tell you what I think was so strong about this, and this is just, as you know, AAQEP emphasizes the freedom to display things the way that you find helpful to display them. What was helpful for the reviewers in this display was you saw the many measures related to an aspect all together in one place with a very clear picture, and then the overall roll up to the standard level was also very helpful. So I would say this was a very helpful approach to the data display. But yeah, for standards 3 and 4, I'm sure someone will come up with something similar, but I haven't seen it yet.
Okay, my understanding is standard 1 and 3, they are foundational standards,
Yes.
whereas 2 and 4 are aspiration, right?
More context dependent and aspirational. Yes.
Right.
Yes. Although for standard 2, yeah, go ahead, Lynn, because you guys did the same thing for standard 2, right?
Yeah, we did. But standard 2 is a work in progress for us. We certainly don't have as many data sets for standard 2 as we do for standard 1. And so, but we did represent our data for standard 2 in the same way.
Yeah. Jenny. Good to see you. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question, Lynn and Athena, is kind of a nuts and bolts thing. Where do you store your data? Where do you keep it? I'm new to my role, and I really want to be a data person, but I never have been exactly a data person,
Right.
although I'm excited about it. But I'm just
We,
trying to picture where
yeah.
to keep it all.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that at our AAQEP presentation in Indianapolis. But we currently use Ed Reports. Do you use Ed Reports to pull Ed TPA data?
Mm-hmm.
So we pull it by program. We make a chart. Athena works on a chart. She has an ongoing data chart for Ed TPA, for every program, for every rubric, for every year. And every year she'll drop a year off and add the next year. So we'll probably share that picture in Indianapolis. So we store that in Google Docs. We have a Google Doc right now, a Google folder with all our AAQEP, everything from AAQEP, because we just had our visit. So the plan is now we have 7 years. We're going to keep it up, right? We're going to make a folder for 22, 23. And Athena and I are going to go through all of our data charts, and we're going to update them with 2023 data. And then the data sheets that we pull from Ed Reports, or that we pull from live text when we pull our reports on final student teaching evals, and just have a folder of that raw data, I guess you would call it, for every year. And I find Google folders the best. We're going to call it, annual data, because we have state reports, and we have annual reports for AAQEP. We have data reports for PELSB, which is our state standards board. So we need to have a place to grab it. So Google Docs is our favorite, and we don't do it routinely, Jenny, but my vision is, like, at the end of the school year, we'll pull all the reports from Ed Reports and from live text, get that data by program in a folder, and then update our charts that you saw just now every year, so that when it's time for all these reports, everything is ready. We don't have to go backwards 3 years. If we just do a little bit every single year, everything will stay up to date.
Thank you so much. That's helpful.
And in doing that, Lynn, you'll have sort of a heat map that you look at from year to year to say, how are things shifting and changing, and what a great way to have a visual representation of like a lot of work behind it. Because in measurement terms, you don't want to lose the precision of the data, but you can always reduce it in order to tell the story more clearly. And I think that's just a great thing that's happened.
And our site team, AAQEP site team, in the pre-site visit did ask, is there data behind these charts, right? These charts with 1s, 2s, and 3s and colors on them. And there was, and they wanted to see it. So we created another folder, right, for the offsite conversation. We quickly pulled it together, not in the way I wanted, but that's why we're just going to keep doing it now every year. Get that raw data out, and get it in a Google folder, so that if anybody wants to see it, it's ready.
Yeah, and in fact, just to reflect on the process, because each of you on the screen are in a different place in relation to the process, that's exactly what we define the review team's task as, right? Is to verify the evidence that's in the report. So the report presented it beautifully. They verified what was behind it, and that's why you have 7 years. So, so good. All right, others with questions. I'm trying to look around, watching the chat, and some folks have to leave. Aida, yes, hello, how are you? Please. You're still muted, Aida.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is keeping warm. My question maybe is in terms of process. At Fordham, we're just beginning. So it seems I'm curious as to when were you able to, how many quality reports have you written? When did you start to collect data? I'm assuming, it's sort of like every year, but in terms of trying to make sense of the data, collecting data with this purpose in mind, when did you start and how long did it take you to really find a way of making sense of the data since you became a member of AAQEP?
Sure. Well, even before AAQEP, we had been previously accredited by 2 other national accreditors since the early 70s, right? So we've been doing a little of that work, but there was a time where everything dropped, right? So we had to start from scratch. So I'll start there for you. It took Athena and me probably the better part of a semester to do this deep dive into which data sets should we use, which pieces of the data set should we use, where does it match, right? We had to make this whole chart for every aspect of standard 1 and 2. What data are we going to use for each aspect? So that's where we were doing rubric 6 here, at TPA rubric 7 and 8 here, task 1 for all of this, so we made that chart. That took us a while. And then we started looking at what are the cuts. So I would say a good semester and a half to come up with that clearly defined alignment and then evaluation. What's a 1, what's a 2, what's a 3? But now we're doing annual data days where we're taking this year's data sets and we're putting them in the format, right, that we now have. And we're going to have a whole data day at department retreat where we look at every program and we write up data-driven decisions, and those data-driven decisions guide our work in the next year. And we're going to report on those data-driven decisions for our annual reports. But the pre-work that Athena and I presented, Athena, don't you think a good semester and a half for sure?
Yeah, it was definitely the legwork behind getting everything set up that took the most of the time. Yeah.
Thanks.
And splitting out, like we have two initial licensure elementary ed programs, one at undergrad and one at grad. And we were reporting them together. And that wasn't because they're totally different programs and their data sets are totally different. But when we get our reports from ed reports, or we pull reports for our final student teaching eval, sometimes we have to do it by person because it doesn't come to us by program. So that was messy, getting the list of who did their ed TPA from the MAT program in fall and who were the undergrads, so we can split those numbers out. So the by program pulling of reports was harder because I had to get the list of names from our Center for Institutional Research. What are the names of the people in this secondary program? Okay, now I can go to ed reports and pull their content and pedagogy exams. And those are our students for this year for that program. So it's who's ever your person for getting that data, and for us, it's me right now, that takes a while.
Mhm.
And then to bring it to Athena and say, now let's make sense of it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was confusing.
Thank you.
All right. Well, as we see, some people had scheduled their next meetings already and had to drop off, which often happens. And
Can I just say
any last-
something, Mark? We're
Yeah.
very happy to talk individually with anyone on here, because we've come a long way since 2015 in this area. And we were early adopters at CAPE. That didn't go really well. Then we got better. And now we feel like we're just really on track, using data, pulling data, analyzing data. So Athena and I are happy to meet with any of you who want to talk through this more thoroughly from your context, right? We're happy to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And unless anyone else has any other questions, I'm looking around the screen. Doesn't look like it. So Athena, Lynn, thank you so much. And of course, our thanks to Ray as well, who had to hop off. Just delightful to have have you paired in this presentation, because I knew that, as soon as I opened your QAR and looked at it, I said, I bet you went to Ray and Mark's presentation, because there it was, the visual scaling presented there. So wonderful to have this together. And I hope this gets a lot of views, and those of you who are here today can look at the recording again as well. So thanks for being here, everyone, and have a wonderful day.